Can an innocent game turn a village into hell? Did you know that the spark that ignited the infamous Salem witch hunt, which led to 20 people being sent to the gallows, was a simple fortune-telling game whispered in a kitchen? It all began in the bone-chilling winter of 1692, when the wooden walls of Reverend Samuel Parris's house began to echo with moans unlike any human voice. Uncontrollable screams, incomprehensible whispers, and the bodies of 2 young girls stretched taut like a bow by invisible hands. The Reverend's 9-year-old daughter, Betty, and his 11-year-old niece, Abigail Williams. The doctor's knowledge was exhausted in this darkness. The faint light of science could not penetrate this house, walled up by Puritan faith, and in minds living in fear of God, seeing the image of Satan in every shadow, that ancient, primitive fear sprouted anew. Satan was among them. This was the work of a witch. So, who had brought this evil affliction upon them? Who had brought these innocent souls to the gates of hell? Before long, a name slipped from lips sealed with fear. That woman, torn from the lands carrying the scent of sun and spices from Barbados. That foreigner with a different language, a different skin, a different soul. Tituba. Winter in Salem froze not only the ground, but also the souls. Father Samuel Parris's kitchen was a flimsy refuge against the cold seeping into the rest of the house. Unlike the depictions of hell Father Parris described in his Sunday sermons, for Tituba, the real hell was this endless cold. She longed for Barbados' humid, warm soil, the sun caressing her skin, the insects singing at night, and the belief that her ancestors' spirits whispered there. There, spirits were not things to be feared, but part of life. Here, the spirit was merely a prize in the war between God and the devil. The earthy scent of plants simmering in the air mingled with the smoky smell of burning oak wood. Standing before the hearth, a woman cast shadows on her face in the orange glow of the flames. Tituba. Her skin bore the color of earth and sun, unlike the pallid complexion of the people of this bleak land. Her eyes were as dark and deep as the warm Caribbean nights. They held both the wisdom of the ocean and the bottomless sorrow brought by slavery. "What do you see, Tituba?" whispered Abigail, her voice seemingly afraid to disturb the sanctity of the moment. "What does the future hold for us? Who will my husband be? Will he be rich?" A faint smile appeared on Tituba's lips. For her, it was a game, an innocent pastime that warmed the cold nights. It was just one of the old customs she had learned in her homeland, Barbados, of listening to the whispers of spirits. There, such fortune-telling was a village festival. Here, it meant whispering with the devil. She was aware of the danger, but she couldn't resist the girl's curious gazes. "The future is not clear water, little bird," said Tituba, her voice like a melody from the ocean floor. "It is murky. But look, there is a shape here, a coffin." Betty suddenly let out a small scream. Abigail's eyes sparkled more with curiosity than fear. At that moment, it wasn't just the temperature in the kitchen that changed. The curtain had been lifted on an innocent game, and the darkness behind it had taken its first step into the room. That night, the egg white placed in water to see the future was the first drop of a bloody prophecy that would descend upon Salem. The prophecy did not keep itself waiting. Began with Betty Parris. The quiet and docile girl suddenly began to hear inexplicable sounds inside the house. When alone in her room, she would talk to someone, then suddenly scream into the void. Before long, Abigail began exhibiting the same strange behavior, even more violently. It was as if invisible needles were piercing their skin, as if hidden hands were trying to strangle them. Their bodies contorted in ways that defied the limits of human anatomy. Their spines stretched like springs, and guttural growls resembling animal sounds came from their mouths. They ran out of the room, tried to throw themselves into the fire, and responded to prayers and hymns with curses. Salem's physician, William Griggs, examined the girls for days. He listened to their pulses, examined their tongues, and checked their blood. But no disease in the medical books could give a name to this horror. It was beyond his knowledge. Finally, he looked at Father Parris's face, frozen with fear, and whispered those 3 words: "The devil's hand has touched them." This was not a medical diagnosis, but a verdict. It was the harbinger of a plague. The issue was no longer finding a cure, but finding a culprit. And Father Parris was determined to find the source of this hell that had descended upon his home. The salvation of his daughter and niece meant the salvation of his own reputation. His eyes turned to the only stranger in the house, Tituba, standing by the stove in the kitchen, looking quieter and more inscrutable than ever. The community's patience was wearing thin. Rumors were seeping in like winter winds under the doors. A neighbor, Mary Sibley, in an act of desperation, turned to Tituba. She whispered an ancient English counterspell into her ear: "Witch's cake." According to this tradition, if a cake made from rye flour mixed with the urine of the victims was fed to a dog, the witch's identity would be revealed or the spell would be broken. While the Reverend was away from home, Tituba mixed the girl's urine with rye flour. Her hands trembled as she kneaded the strange, damp cake that emerged. This was not her tradition. It was the Puritans' own dark superstition. But she was too afraid to refuse. She feared the father's wrath, the neighbor's suspicion, and most of all, the hysteria of this incomprehensible land. They baked the cake and fed it to the family dog. They waited. Nothing happened. The dog continued to sleep peacefully. But even though the spell failed, when the news reached Father Parris's ears, all hell broke loose. Without his authority or knowledge, a demonic ritual had been performed in his home. Father Parris stormed into the house. His face was that of the wrathful God he preached about. "In my house. How dare you perform the devil's magic in God's house?" He roared. His voice shook the pots in the kitchen. Tituba's defense, beginning with, "But you wanted it," Mary Sibley said ... was cut short by the crack of the pastor's whip in the air. Pain slithered across her back like an icy snake. This was only the beginning of the interrogation. Physical pain was only the first step of hell, used to break her spirit. Days of pressure, sleeplessness, and repeated lashes shattered Tituba's resistance. That day, the whispers ended, and the official accusation was stamped on Tituba's forehead like an iron brand. The Salem Meeting House was a sacred place built for worshiping God. But on that day, the echoes within its walls were not hymns, but the cold whispers of an Inquisition court. The air was so heavy, it felt like an invisible weight pressing down on shoulders. Breathing was difficult in this suffocating atmosphere, where sweat mingled with the acrid, sharp smell of sooty candles and the collective fear of the crowd. Tituba stood alone before Judge John Hathorne and Jonathan Corwin. Behind her was a living, merciless wall of faces staring at her with hatred, fear, and morbid curiosity. "Tituba," Hathorne began. His voice was as cold and hard as the surface of a gravestone. It cut through the thick air in the room like a knife, leaving no room for innocence. "Why are you harming these children? With what spirit did you make a pact?" "I haven't harmed them," Tituba whispered, her voice trembling like a leaf. I'm not a witch." This feeble denial caused an angry murmur to rise from the crowd. At that very moment, as if receiving an invisible signal, the tortured girls began to convulse and thrash about in the hall once more. Abigail pointed her finger at Tituba like a dagger and screamed, "Tituba! She's doing it! She's sending a yellow bird. She's biting me." All eyes locked onto Tituba, the center of this horrific spectacle. She was the monster everyone in the room wanted to see. Her denial seemed like the greatest proof of her guilt. as dangerous and false as a snake's hiss. The hours stretched on like eternity. The same questions, phrased differently, pounded on him relentlessly like a merciless tide. Each denial was followed by more pressure, more threats, and more pain. His master Parris's eyes locked onto him like a predator. Leaning close to his ear, he whispered that the only way out was to confess, that God's mercy was with those who accepted their sins. The cold gnawing at his body, the hunger gnawing at his stomach, the exhaustion consuming his spirit, and the unrelenting burning sting of the whip marks on his back. His resistance was slowly melting away like a candle. He thought of Barbados' hot sun, his mother's face, the times when he was free. It was all now nothing more than a distant dream. The only reality was this cold room, these hate-filled faces, and the inevitable end. At that moment, she understood with terrifying clarity that truth had no value here. They wanted a story that would validate their fears, absolve their sins. Hathorne, his patience exhausted, roared one last time. "Has the devil taken you into his service, woman?" Tituba raised her head. Her eyes were filled with tears, but her gaze was empty. Her spirit had been completely crushed under this senseless savagery. There was only one way left to survive, to give them the story they wanted to hear, to create their monster with her own mouth. She would weave a tale from Master Parris's sermons, her neighbors' superstitions, and her own deepest fears. And Tituba began to speak. As the words poured from her mouth, a deadly silence fell over the room. It was as if the world had held its breath. She was no longer a slave from Barbados. She was a messenger bringing news from hell itself. "The devil. Yes, he came," she said, her voice cracked but clear. "Sometimes like a pig, sometimes like a big black dog. But mostly, he was a tall, white-haired man from Boston." By adding this detail, she cleverly implied that evil came from outside, from known worlds. A muffled cry of fear rose from the crowd. The judges leaned forward curiously. "He wanted me to serve him," Tituba continued, her eyes fixed on a point in the void. "He showed me a book, a thick red book. He wanted me to sign it with my blood. And I was afraid. I resisted, but I signed it." This confession was like the dam bursting. Until that moment, the courtroom had been a place where only doubts and whispers echoed. But now the words pouring from Tituba's lips engulfed the room like fire seizing dry straw. The story was no longer the judge's or the villagers', it was hers. And with trembling lips, she wove this horrific tale in every minute detail. She spoke of nights illuminated by moonlight. She recounted being taken from her bed, flying through the sky with the devil atop a broomstick. She said the devil's cloak fluttered in the wind as they passed over Salem's rooftops. She described the rituals performed in the darkest corners of the forest. The branches looked like skeletal hands reaching toward the sky, and the earth seemed to drink in the whispered spells. And then she made the gravest accusation: she was not alone. There were other witches, 4 of them, from Salem. The judges leaned forward. The villagers pricked up their ears. The silence became suffocating. Only the crackling of the fireplace and the occasional gasp could be heard. When names were demanded, Tituba hesitated. She rubbed her hands together for a long time, her gaze wandering among the faces in the crowd. This was the most dangerous step. To drag others into her lie meant to shoulder the responsibility for their fate. She stood as if on the edge of a precipice. Once the words left her mouth, there would be no turning back. Her lips parted, then closed. Fear pounded in her chest like a second heart. But instinct, that primal, do whatever it takes to survive, inner voice, was stronger than conscience. With trembling hands, she picked 2 faces from the crowd, 2 women, 2 lives. And in that moment, their worlds shattered. Sarah Good. Her name had long been tarnished by poverty and suspicion. The villagers knew her well. She was a homeless beggar wandering the cold streets of Salem, her thin shawl offering no protection against the wind and cold. She often knocked on Reverend Parris' door, asking for bread. When refused, she would grumble and walk away, like a bad omen. Children feared her, believing her eyes were so unlucky they could sour milk. So her name was tailor-made to be the first target. Sarah Osborne's reputation was no better. She had been confined to her sickbed for years. Her body was bent with disease, shrouded in shadows. She was feuding with her neighbors over an inheritance, and worst of all, she hadn't set foot in church for months. In a place like Salem, where people lived in fear of God, this was a crime in itself. No one would defend them. They were outcasts, easy prey. Good and Osborne, Tituba finally whispered. Her voice was barely audible, but in that silent courtroom, her words thundered. They were there too. They signed the book. They forced me. They wanted me to harm the children. A murmur rose from the crowd. Heads turned toward the accused women. Sarah Good shook her head in panic, her hair falling over her face. Her angry cries were drowned out by the roar of the crowd. Sarah Osborne collapsed exhausted into the line, her lips trembling as she murmured a prayer. Tituba's confession spread through Salem like the plague. She had not merely lied to save her own life. She had started the hunting season. Neighbors began to suspect each other. Friends accused each other. Fear turned to hysteria, a mental epidemic. And on that day, innocents died in Salem. Tituba had escaped the gallows for now, but she was not free. The cold stone walls of Boston prison were now her world. The damp walls reeked of rot. At night, rats scurried among the straw, their squeaks mingling with the moans of the other prisoners. The confession that saved him may have protected his body, but it had chained his soul. At night, in his sleep, he still heard them. The screams of the women he had named. Sarah Good's curses of rage. Sarah Osborne's praying lips. And then the ghosts of dozens of people who would be accused, tortured, and led to the gallows. The monsters Tituba had conjured were no longer in the forest. They had become the nightmares that gnawed at his mind. He rotted in that stone cell for over a year. Time lost its meaning. Winter turned to spring, spring to summer, but the walls always whispered the same coldness. Reverend Parris did not spend a single penny to save this woman who had once served him. In his eyes, Tituba was now useless, a used, shameful tool. She had been important as long as she was useful. Now she was nothing but a burden. In the end, her fate was sealed in the most ordinary way. She was sold to pay off her debts, like an animal. She was transferred to a man whose name was not even recorded. From that day on, Tituba quietly withdrew from the stage of history. As if he had never existed, he was erased from documents, letters, memories. The voice that once shook an entire community has now faded into nothingness. But Salem did not remain silent. The spark he ignited burned the entire village. 19 people were sent to the gallows. One was stoned to death, his bones crushed in agony. Families were torn apart, children orphaned, reputations shattered. Years later, when the hysteria ended, regret came. Mistakes were confessed, forgiveness sought, shame accepted. But it was too late for Tituba. Her story had long been etched into the shadows, a reminder of how fear can turn the innocent into monsters, how society can so easily choose its weakest as victims. Even today, her name remains a warning. She is remembered neither with honor nor justice, but she still lives on to show how fear grows in the dark. Tituba's story began as an innocent whisper under Barbados' scorching sun, but ended as a death cry echoing across Salem's icy, unforgiving soil. The single lie she told to survive dragged a community where seeds of fear and suspicion had already been sown into an uncontrollable storm of hysteria and paranoia, a storm that swallowed the lives of 20 innocent people, never to return. This tragic story leaves us with a question that cuts deep into our minds, as simple as it is terrifying. How far can a person go to save their own life? What lines can they cross? What dark paths can they take to protect their own existence? And perhaps more importantly, when a community transforms its most vulnerable member into a monster, a reflection of its own suppressed fears and superstitions, who is truly the sinner? Is it Tituba, forced to tell that lie by her survival instinct? Or is it the people of Salem who pushed her into that lie, hiding in the shadow of the monster they created? Share your thoughts on this complex moral dilemma in the comments section. In the next part of the story, we will examine the heartbreaking fate of Sarah Good and Sarah Osborne, the first and most tragic victims of the witch hunt named by Tituba. Join us on this dark journey. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss a moment of this tragedy.